Hello and welcome to this demonstration of the AppSense user virtualization platform. In this session I'll be focusing on just two of the elements that make up the user policy and user personalization. I'm going to be running this demonstration from this single desktop. From here I'm going to connect to a number of virtual machines as two different users. At AppSense we talk about user virtualization, but that doesn't mean you need any virtualization technologies in place for you to see the benefits of using AppSense. The more technologies that you throw in there into your environment to deliver desktops, to deliver their applications, starts to make your environment more complex. And this is exactly where you start to reap the benefits of using AppSense. The two users in my environment that I'm going to connect to desktops with is an accountant and an engineer. My accountant needs access to finance-specific applications, maybe a small check printer and a secured area on the network for the finance share. My engineer, however, needs a different type of desktop. They need access to applications such as CAD applications, maybe a large A0 plotter printer, and a shared area that only the engineers can see. What I'm trying to point out here is that having a standardized build desktop, trying to push that out to everybody is not going to work. We need to apply different business policies to the desktops so they're fit for purpose. What I'm going to do now is log on to the first machine. The first machine I'm going to log on to is my XP desktop as my engineer. Now if we think of typical methods that we use to apply policy, we think of group policies and we think of logon scripts. Both of those methods are considered third line tasks to manage, so a third line cost to the organisation, and also the renown for slowing down the logon. If I log on to this desktop with AppSense enabled applying the policy, what you'll see here is that the user can log on to the desktop in under 10 seconds, sub 20 seconds, and that's because we have a multi-threaded agent which is analysing a number of conditions and based on the results of those conditions building a fit for purpose desktop. So we're applying policy as and when it's required. Here you can see the resultant set of those conditions means that we're building that desktop to look and feel like an engineer's desktop. We're doing things such as firing up the engineer's CAD applications, we're setting a specific background for the engineers, putting shortcuts on the desktop that they require, and also chopping down this start menu so it doesn't see everything that's necessarily installed on this machine, but just gives the user visibility of the applications which they require. So maybe a handful of accessories and a couple of the office products. We're also doing things such as applying drives, mapping drives and mapping printers. So this is quite typically what a logon script would do anyway. But as I said, logon scripts by their nature slow down the logon process, and then by their namesake they apply everything as and when the user logs on. Now think of the logon scripts and all those things that might be applying in a just in case mentality. All the things that are applying that might not be actually required during that user's session. In particular, if you think of specific policies which are applied to specific applications. Maybe we are mapping a printer which is specific to only one application. Maybe we're moving any files for specific apps. Maybe we're applying group policy to the office products. But what if the user doesn't actually use those products in question? We've wasted time during the logon process applying unnecessary policies. Well, what we can do with AppSense is we can start to be a little bit more clever and efficient on when we apply our policies. I'm going to take you into the console for a second just to show you on the left hand side here what we mean by the AppSense in session trigger points. If we talk about triggers, you can see here that we have a log on and log off as a trigger. So nothing too special there because as I said that's where logon scripts are applying and some of the group policies will also apply. But what you'll see that we also have within AppSense is the ability to use in-session triggers such as process start and stop. So that's an application launching and an application closing. We can see when there's a network connect, disconnect, a session reconnect, disconnect, and a locked and unlocked. What this means is now we don't have to apply all of the policy at the logon prompt, at the logon trigger in a just in case mentality. We can actually start to apply the policy on demand. As an example here, if I go back to my user, logged onto their XP desktop, when the user logged onto this desktop, AppSense has applied a number of policies in parallel using our multi-threaded agent, but we've also done a lot of things at logon. We've set the background, we've fired up the application, and as you saw there, we've mapped the engineer's home drive and also the engineer's shared drive. But in my demo environment here, I also have an application which requires a drive for the application to run correctly. That application is Adobe Reader, and that drive is the common drive. As you can see during the logon trigger, or during the logon process, we did nothing more than map the two drives. But because we can use this process trigger, so when we see the Adobe Reader process start, we can use that to trigger the mapping of the common drive. The application has full access to that drive, as it would have done if it was mapped at logon. And then when the user is finished with the application, we can use the process stop as another trigger to unmap that drive. A further example, if I go into the actual printers, you see here that when everybody logs on, everybody gets the default AFUB printer. But then when my engineer uses that one and only CAD application that requires the A0 plotter printer, the act of launching that application maps the printer. We can also set that to be the default printer whilst that application is open. The engineer can print his CAD applications just by going File Print, doesn't have to worry about selecting the correct printer, and then when the user is finished with the application, they close the app, we can disconnect the printer and set the old one back to the default. So here what we're doing is basically applying the policy on demand. Let's remove as much of the policy as we can from the logon trigger, applying the minimum amount of policy when the user logs on, getting the user logged onto the desktop as quickly as possible, but then applying the policy as and when it's required. So here we can get the user logged on quickly, so that's a thumbs up for the users. But also those third line tasks of managing group policy, of managing the logon scripts. Now we can start to manage the user's policy within the AppSense wizard driven consoles. So now it's less of a third line task to manage those policies, maybe something that a second line can pick up and manage. If I now log off this desktop, you saw how we applied the policy to this machine so that desktop looked and felt like an engineer's desktop. I'm going to log straight back onto that same machine now, but as my different user. So now I'm logging on as my finance user, my accountant. Again, AppSense is analysing a number of conditions and applying policies when that user logs on in parallel. So again, we've got a sub 20-second log on for the user. Not only is this quick, it's going to be consistently quick. Now that my user is a different user, maybe in a different part of the business, this is a finance user, we've applied a different policy. We've made that desktop look and feel like a completely different desktop, building it fit for purpose for this user. So now we've got the stereotypical finance application firing up, a different background, different shortcuts, even a different look and feel to the start menu. Now, because this is used in the finance department as well as the accessories that everybody sees, we've now got finance specific applications, maybe more of the Office products visible to this group of users. So that's all we talked about there, is applying policy. IT applying and enforcing business rules onto the user. One other element of the user that I'm going to talk about now is the user's personalization. If we think of personalization, personalization is everything that makes that desktop specific to the user. Now this is the desktop that everybody in finance gets, but what makes that desktop my personal desktop is the fact that I've made changes to my applications, made changes to the preferences. That might be something as simple as moving toolbars around, maybe in the Adobe Reader product, or maybe this is going into more of a corporate application. So let's say Microsoft Word here, and maybe I'm making changes such as modifying the quick access toolbars. I'm not happy with the default background, so pick another one of those, so change it to silver, and maybe I'll change my custom dictionary, so I'll pick something random there. So there's my custom dictionary set to Spanish El Salvador. So here I've now personalized a number of applications, and maybe there are settings that I've made consciously, or it might be changes to the applications that are going on in the background that the user's not so aware of. Such things as the NK2 file within Outlook. It's a great example. Every time you send an email to somebody, the first time you type that email out, you'll type it in full for the first time. The next time you want to send an email to that same person, you may type the first few letters of their name, and Outlook will provide a list of email addresses. So it's this type of information that the user wants to keep from session to session, from desktop to desktop, however IT are delivering that desktop to the user. And it's not only application personalization either. There may be things, the changes that the user makes to the desktop, operating system personalization, maybe making changes to the toolbars, their quick launch, pinned items, etc. Maybe changing their accessibility options because they have poor visibility. If we think of the traditional methods of capturing that user's personalization, we might think of roaming profiles. Now, as we're aware, or as you're aware, this desktop that I'm currently logged onto is a Windows XP desktop. If we enabled roaming profiles, maybe the user will be able to log on to another XP desktop, but with the roaming profiles seem to carry a lot of bloat. Again, renowned for slowing down that logon process, because there's a lot of personalization in there for applications that we're not interested in, and there's also a lot of temporary files, temporary folders, stuff that we actually don't want to persist between user sessions. If we then start to throw in a little bit more complexity, maybe we're going through an XP to Windows 7 migration. If we think of that, then immediately we've hit a barrier, because we're going from version 1 profiles in Windows XP to version 2 profiles in Windows 7. So even if we did enable roaming profiles, we'd have two separate profiles, a version 1 and a version 2. That personalization wouldn't persist across those two different versioned operating systems. If we also start to throw in more virtualization technologies in, maybe we're going from physical desktops to virtual desktops, maybe we're publishing applications, maybe we start to stream applications in, maybe using Citrix technologies, AppV technologies, etc. to deliver these applications now. The more and more complexities we throw in there, the harder it is to persist that user's personalization from where it is today, maybe in a migration process, but also managing it going forward. What I'm going to do now is show you how we do things differently with AppSense. First of all, we don't capture all of the personalization that would normally be associated with the roaming profile. We give IT the ability to identify business critical applications that they want to allow the users to be able to personalize. So let's just say in this example it might be the Office products, the Adobe Reader products, and maybe some of the in-house finance applications. What we can do with AppSense, we can just target those applications and ignore the rest of the bloat. The second thing that we do differently is we don't wait for the user to log off their desktop before this application personalization is captured. To demonstrate this, I've already logged onto a second desktop as my user before I started to make that personalization and those changes. As you can see here, this desktop looks and feels very familiar to the finance users. It's got the same background, it's got the same shortcuts, same applications fired up, and even the start menu looks and feels the same. Now, this isn't exactly the same because this isn't another XP desktop, but what we've done is we've made it look and feel very similar. The reason why it's not exactly the same is because I've tried to throw in as much complexity into this by going to a Windows 2008 R2 server. So here I've gone from a desktop operating system to a server OS. I've gone from 32-bit to 64-bit OS, but more importantly, I've gone from version 1 to version 2 profiles. As you can see here, AppSense has applied a policy onto this desktop the same way we did onto the Windows XP desktop to make it look and feel a fit-for-purpose desktop. But not only that, if I start to launch the applications that I have just personalized in my concurrent session, you'll actually see that this user's personalization is following the user across. So if I launch my Adobe Reader there, you can see that the toolbars have been moved around. I launch Microsoft Word, we've got the silver background, we've got the quick access toolbars which have been changed, and if I go into my custom dictionary, we can see that the Spanish El Salvador custom dictionary has been persisted. So there's two things that are happening out of the ordinary there. Firstly, the user hasn't logged off their desktop before AppSense has captured that personalization. And secondly, this is version 1 to version 2 profiles that the user's personalization is persisting across. Normally something that would be kept completely separate. So how are we doing things? Well, if I make a further change, so I go from the only other option that we had to go to black, and I modify this desktop, again changing the personalization. These changes would normally be registry rights to HKey current user, and maybe file changes that would normally be set in the app data area in the user's profile. As I mentioned before, with AppSense we give the administrators the ability to target specific applications that we want to allow users to be able to personalize. When one of those applications fires up, this is where AppSense wraps its virtualization technology around that process. That process now has the AppSense technology laid around there, and any writes that application makes to the user profile area, whether it be the file system or the user registry, we virtualize those changes and store them in a local cache. When the user has finished with the application, the user closes down this application. This is when we capture those settings. So this is when we're saving that personalization for that application on a per application basis. And we're storing those settings in our personalization server database. Now this is a very important part to understand, because this is the point that we now decouple or unlock that user from the operating system and from the application delivery mechanism. That means that it doesn't matter that that application was last run on a 2008 R2 server desktop and it was a locally installed version of that application. I now have the personalization for my accountant stored in the personalization server database for Word 2007. What that then means is IT are now free to deliver that desktop and deliver the applications however they see fit. This may mean a transformation may be going from one operating system to the next, but as we all know out there, it's not just a one-way or a one-step forward migration. In these transformation projects, we also see a number of instances where old desktop operating systems still need to sit in our environment. As an example, I'm just going to jump backwards now. That was Windows XP to Windows 2008 R2, both locally installed applications. What I'm now going to do is go back to my Windows XP desktop. I'm going to run that same application, but now I'm going to use a different delivery mechanism. I'm now going to run Microsoft Word 2007 via AppV. AppV delivery normally something which has its own isolated file system, its own isolated registry, right into the PKG file, i.e. having its own personalization stored in that PKG file. But because AppSense doesn't care how the user is running the application, on which operating system or which delivery mechanism, we just see the user launch Word 2007, we can then pull down that personalization from the personalization server, applying that personalization on demand. So the benefits here to the user is that the user is unaware and basically doesn't care how IT are delivering that application. All they know is that the last time they used that application, the personalization has persisted. A further benefit to the end user is in the fact that when we actually apply this personalization, unlike a roaming profile that loads all of the personalization for every application that a user may have ever used at logon, we only apply a minimum amount of personalization at logon. The personalization that we apply at logon is what we class as desktop personalization. Think of that as being operating system personalization. So has the user changed their mouse to a left-handed mouse, maybe changed their keyboard language, maybe they've changed their accessibility options as I mentioned earlier. That's all we load when the user logs on. So a small number of registry keys, sub 100k, getting the user logged onto that desktop not only quickly but consistently. Unlike a roaming profile which bloats over time, because we're loading just a minimum amount of personalization, it's going to be quick now, it's going to be quick going forward. We only apply the personalization for these selected applications as and when the user launches that application. So my user logs on, they log on quickly, they launch an application. If it's an application that we're allowing the user to personalize the app, we pull down the personalization. The user makes modifications, they close the application down. Any of those changes are again stored in our personalization server database. When the user logs off, we give them a quick log off because we're not saving any personalization at that point. So that's one benefit for the user. If I log off this desktop now, I'm also going to show you some further benefits for the user as well. And what I'm talking about now is what happens when something goes wrong with the user's personalization. So as an example now, back to my 2008 R2 desktop, I'm going to launch an app. Maybe this is how I've had my application personalized for a long time, and maybe I just make a change to the app that I either break, or maybe there's some form of corruption that's taken place. Now, maybe I don't know how to fix this problem. This would be a call to the first line support desk. Maybe someone from second line will come and try and fix this problem. If they can't fix the problem, maybe it'll get escalated to third line support, all with an associated cost to try and fix this problem. Usually the typical result to fix this issue would be to ask the user to log off their desktop while we delete their profile. Now that's a very quick fix as far as IT is concerned, but obviously, as we know as users, if we delete your profile, that will fix that Microsoft Word issue by setting it back to its default first settings, but it's going to set the whole of the profile back to its first run. What's happened to my accessibility options? What's happened to my toolbars in my other apps? What's happened to my NK2 file in Outlook? Well, there we've lost those settings. The user's going to spend the rest of the day getting back to where they were. Maybe some of those settings lost that they don't know how to get back to. Well, this is now a thing of the past. This is now something which we can fix within AppSense, and we've got two options here. One of the options is to provide IT support, maybe a first line support desk, with a web console. So IT support now have a web console where they have access to all the users within the environment, and here they can select my accountant from this web console and start to remedy any of those issues by selecting one of the applications in question. Now, I could demonstrate how we can do it via first line support, but what I wanted to show you today is how we can actually pass down that fix to the actual end user within our self-service consoles. So back to my user that's logged on. Here we can provide the web console to the user. This is their self-service portal, and they can actually start to fix their own problems. If I scroll down to the bottom here, we can click Next. Inside this very easy to use console, this web console here, the user is now presented with their most used applications. Here we can select their Office products and click Next. And what we'll see now, as well as AppSense actually managing the user's personalization, storing that personalization on a per application basis, on a per application group basis, we can also start to take snapshots or backups of that user's personalization. Here you can see that we've actually got two backups, basically taking the backups as and when we see that the user has made a change to their application. So if the user makes a change, they're working on their application, makes a change to an application today, later on in the evening we take a snapshot if that snapshot is different to the one previous. So now the user has options. What do they want to do? We give them the option. They can actually say, I'm happy with the settings that were on the 3rd of the 5th, or maybe more recently on the 15th of the 5th, and we can actually say restore that backup. Click OK, click OK again. We'll minimize that window, and whereas before that application was broken, that application's personalization is now not only fixed, but this is now rolled back to a last known good configuration, all while still keeping the personalization for all their other applications untouched and intact. So this was a demonstration of the AppSense user virtualization platform, focusing on just two elements: user personalization and user policy. Thank you for joining me.